St Felicity's was the main Catholic church in Wharton. It wasn't hard to miss as it was the second tallest building in town, after Police HQ. Will tells me that it was built of something called millstone grit, which gave it a particular yellow colour, quite distinctive from many of the other buildings around the town. Inside, St Felicity's was just like any other Catholic church, all gold and fancy with all sorts of ornament, decoration and pictures of Jesus hanging on the walls. Even though it was being held in the church, the actual funeral service wasn't going to be a Catholic one. It was only at the place because Greg had been to some music club there when he was a kid. I take this to actually mean he took a weekly visit for the purposes of being touched in inappropriate places, though apparently I'm not allowed to say that out loud. Will and I were running late, so Joe was the first of us to arrive. He was closely followed by Dan, who was accompanying a teary-eyed Eliza. The church, which was reasonably large, was already filling up to capacity, and they all sat together on a pew just ahead of Amanda, and opposite from Randy, who was sitting between two old men who smelt strongly of fish. Some of the people present were adults, mostly Greg's relatives and teachers, but at least 90% of the congregation was made up of teenagers. Some of them were students I recognised from Beiderbecke. Many of them were girls as well. Greg had been incredibly popular, especially with the opposite sex. He was more popular than even Joe had realised. There was some rock music playing out through the church as everybody arrived. According to the order of service, it was a song entitled "When We Stand Together," and had been chosen by Will. The order of service itself was actually dull, and simply just a list of music and readings. It was an order of service, so I don't know what you expected. Much more interesting was a little pamphlet on each pew that was filled with messages that Greg's friends and sympathisers had written. Most of them were pleasant and moving little tributes, whilst the rest looked like they were from stalkers or madmen. Dan was reading this pamphlet when out of the corner of his eye he noticed Robin a few seats ahead, with his feet up against one of the pews. He was the most visibly disgusting presence in the room. You could also see from behind that his back was bent, and he had strong spinal protrusions that almost broke through his clothing. A clear indication, according to Will, that he had undergone genetic transformation. Dan nudged Joe and pointed to him. "He's got a nerve. Bloody Graff. Will's got a theory about him. I'll tell you later," Joe informed quietly, keeping one eye on Eliza to make sure she wasn't listening. A few seconds later the song died and the Reverend, a weedy sort of man in his 50s with a cocky, boring voice and the swagger of a con artist, stepped up to the pulpit. "That song was requested by a young man who was a great friend to Gregory in the final few days of his short but fruitful life. I am told that it was not a song that Gregory knew, but it certainly fits him like a glove. As it goes, the right thing to guide us is right here, inside us. No one can divide us when the light is nearly gone, and just like a heartbeat, the drumbeat carries on." That was truly the ethos Gregory believed in, and he maintained that faith right until the end. I had the great honour and privilege to have known him for many of his... He was interrupted by the sound of myself and Will running up the central aisle to our seats. The only two places left were in the row behind Joe, Dan and Eliza. I've never felt more conscious of being watched in my life. All eyes in that church were upon us, and each one glowered in condemnation. I saw a couple of girls towards the back whisper and point at Will as we passed. I don't blame them. When you stuck him in a suit he looked suave, sophisticated, stylish, and a bit like a teenage James Bond. It was at times like that I had a jealousy towards him, and his inexplicable sex appeal. It always quickly passed though, as I'm not exactly cursed in the looks department myself. "Are we still on for later?" Joe asked, leaning over the back of the pew. Will nodded and gave a thumbs up. "What's going on later?" Eliza questioned. "Will and Joe are going to have hot sweaty bum sex on Greg's grave," Dan joked. It wasn't funny. Eliza certainly didn't seem to think so. The Reverend coughed and we all sat to attention and stared directly at him. He started talking again in that boring and most priestly voice. "We are here to celebrate and mourn the passing of a much beloved soul." There was a loud girly giggle from somewhere towards the middle of the church. "Gregory was always full of boundless energy, an eagerness to do well, and a spirit and moral virtue unsurpassed by any of his generation." He dared a quick glance in Will's direction. "Certainly, he was taken from us tragically, and far too soon. But today is not a day for sadness. Gregory would not have wanted that. He would want us to celebrate, and remember the time he shared with us. So, to begin with, if you could all stand, this was one of Gregory's favourite pieces, and he loved nothing more then riffing along to it on the guitar. Thus ensued 3.5 minutes of the Stranglers singing No More Heroes, whilst everybody in the room stood to attention. The funniest thing about the song was watching Robin. He looked like he was in some sort of pain. He was bent double and clutching his ears like there was something dirty pressing against them. It was quite amusing, but I was soon distracted from his anguish by Will pointing out something odd in the order of service. All of the songs, besides the one Will had picked, had something to do with heroes, which even I thought was really weird. There were ones from David Bowie and Chad Kroeger, which I can't imagine someone like Greg enjoying. But there are also some really weird ones that I'm sure Greg would never have listened to in a million years. Bette Midler and Mariah Carey, for instance. I mean, what? Bette Midler? Will leaned over the pew in front and showed the order of service to Joe. Joe looked confused. Greg hated those songs. He really hated those songs. Eliza snatched the order off him and stared at it. Those songs aren't, Greg. They aren't, she snatched. Somebody in the pew just ahead was listening and had to look at their own order of service to see what we were talking about. I saw them shake their head and then show it to their friend, who laughed at it. What? Are we at the right funeral? Jeez! By the time the song ended, there was a ripple of discontentment running throughout the church. The Reverend stood up at the pulpit. He started talking and everybody went back to silent boredom once more. Gregory Jacob Finch was born on the 3rd of December, 1989. His parents, David and Maureen, could not have been more delighted with their beautiful, bouncing bundle of joy. He was not a big baby, but as he grew and developed, he became tall, slim, and dashing, with a distinct flair for entertaining the ladies. There was a giggle from somewhere in the church. None knew him better than David, the father, whom he loved and adored all his life. Joe screwed up his face in perplexion. What the fuck? Greg and his dad hated each other. They hadn't spoken for 6 months. Greg's dad, Mr. Finch, stepped up to the pulpit. He was a smallish man, rotund with a bristling Stalin-esque moustache that covered his mouth. His hair was a thin circlet of black and grey surrounding a dense patch of glimmering nothingness. At the back the skin of his neck wrinkled up in an ugly fashion, whilst his chin wobbled every time he spoke. Gregory was always a sweet child. There didn't seem to be any sort of care or sincerity or sense of loss in his voice, like you would expect from someone who had lost a beloved child. Joe stared at him as he spoke. He was working something out in his head and moving his lips up and down, but making no sound. Some would say he was perfect. Looking back, I'd be inclined to agree. Yes, we had our differences, but so do all families. I never thought that I would be saying goodbye to him in this way, or even planning his funeral. He was supposed to be planning mine. A smile crept across his face. I think it was supposed to be a joke, but only about 3 people in the entire church gave a suppressed laugh. Eliza scowled at him. He was planning to murder you in your bed, you fucking wanker. You know, it's funny, Mr. Finch dribbled. The night before he died, Gregory and I discussed the future. Inevitably we got onto the subject of death and funerals. Greg was with us the night before he died, wasn't he? I heard a girl whisper from a few rows back. Yeah, he was. Because we finished that cherry-flavoured lube off, another girl said before she was shushed by some old bat who was intensely focused on what Mr. Finch was saying. Gregory didn't want us to grieve. He wanted us to have a short and memorable funeral, and lots of his favourite music. There was an audible murmur of irritation throughout the church. Gregory did not want us to dwell on his death. He wanted us to say goodbye and move on with our lives. I will not talk much more, but I would finally like to thank Will Fleming. Will looked up in alarm. He hadn't been paying attention, still focused on the order, but now his eyes were wide with concern and staring at Mr. Finch. Although he only knew Gregory for a day, he was a good friend. I would like to ask him, if he would, to say a few words. Will looked at me in alarm, but I just pushed him out of the pew and then put my feet on his seat so he couldn't sit back down. He didn't want to go, but I think the overwhelming pressure caused by myself and the collective of mourners staring at him made him do so. He walked slowly up to the front, conscious of every eye upon him. He looked directly at Robin as he passed, and their gazes locked for a fraction of a second. It was in that moment that Will figured out exactly what he had to say, and what effect it would have upon the room. He began to walk with confidence, and stood at the pulpit with the kind of hard look on his face that he had during face-to-face confrontations. I'm not very good at public speaking, so I'll try and keep this brief, he began. Most of you, I'm sure, knew Greg a lot better than I did. I know that he was a big music fan. He even had a CD on release, so I'm told. Quite a good one, allegedly. I've not had a chance to listen to it yet, but I will soon. I promise. One of my favourite lines from a song, and one I think Greg would like as well, comes from American Pie by Don McLean. It goes something like, "And as I watched him on the stage, my hands were clenched in fists of rage. No angel born in hell could break that Satan's spell. No angel born in hell could have saved Greg that day. Believe me, if I could have saved him, I would. I've tried to tell myself that I could, but in reality, I couldn't. No one could have saved him. Don't think that Greg didn't know the danger he undertook. Greg knew damn well that he was risking everything, even his life. Don't assume that Greg's death was in vain either. He died fighting an evil terror known as a Graph." He gave a warning glance in Robin's direction. Robin snarled and dared him to continue. Will took the dare and ran with it as fast as he could. Greg understood the threat posed by them. He knew the risks he was taking and he wasn't afraid. He was fearless, and when his time came he embraced his death. He died saving Beiderbecke from demons few can comprehend the true and terrifying nature of. Greg gave his life to ensure that Beiderbecke remained an untainted bastion of human civilization against the mutated forces of depravity and degradation. Today it still stands as a beacon of education in the ever-increasing darkness of our world. Thanks in part to Greg. Will paused. He took a long look around the church. Everybody was fixated on him. Some of the older people in the room were looking at him in horror, aghast at what he was saying. Some people were looking at him with disgust. The rest were being inspired by a legend in the full flower of articulating his point. Will took a deep breath, and he rounded off the speech with a rather beautiful climax. There are bleak and difficult times ahead of us, but we can all learn a lesson from Greg's life. We can learn to be strong. We must learn not to fear. We must learn not to fear the encroaching darkness. We may even have to embrace the darkness, to beat the evil that threatens our world before the end. Evil cannot harm us if we are not afraid. Greg knew this, and we must all remember him as a noble and true human being, right until the end. I'm sure he would not want any one of you to forget him, or the cause he died fighting for. And then, when Satan takes to the stage, we shall break his spell, if we remember not to be afraid. Thank you." As he stepped down from the pulpit, there was a massive upsurge of applause from the church that took him completely by surprise. I don't think Will knew that he could make a speech that was so effective just on the spur of the moment like that. I wonder if he had ever even tried. Robin stood up, incensed by it all, and he blocked Will from walking down the aisle of the church. "This isn't over, Fleming," he snapped before spitting on the floor. He then crawled away, with his head glistening with thoughts of revenge and hatred that only the Graph mind can conjure. Will smirked. Now he had Robin exactly where he wanted him. He'd be back to take his revenge at Greg's wake for sure. And then, Will would be ready for him.